All right, Chapter 19, Part 4, Agency Relationships. Now we're talking about liability of the principal for the acts of the agent for torts and crimes. An agent is liable for their own acts to the third party. The principal can be liable for the agent's tortuous acts if they result from the principal's tortuous conduct, the principal's authorization of agent's tortuous conduct, or liability for the agent's misrepresentation. So a principal who acts through an agent may be liable for harm resulting from the principal's own negligence or recklessness due to improper instructions, authorization to use improper materials or tools, or improper rules that result in the agent's committing a tort. If the principal authorizes the agent to commit a tort, then they may be liable for persons or property that were damaged or injured. If the agent misrepresents something to the third party that causes harm, the principal can be liable depending upon whether the agent was acting actually or with apparent authority to make the misrepresentations. The principal is always directly responsible for an agent's misrepresentation that's made within the scope of the agent's authority. Okay, what about the agent's negligence? Now, this is probably one of the most important areas, more important than the previous three slides. This is the one that we run into the most with business organizations because they act through agents that are employees. And it's called the doctrine of respondent superior, or also known as vicarious liability. And basically what it says is that the general rule is that a principal is liable for the tortious acts, the negligent acts of the agent that cause injury to someone else, so long as those acts are in the course and scope of employment. Okay, this is very important for businesses. This is why you want to make sure that you have insurance or make sure that you have the form of a business that limits your liability, and we'll be talking about that in subsequent chapters. Okay, so this is very important. Now, a couple of things to know here. First of all, there's a concept of what's called frolic and detour. So if an employee is acting, an agent or employee is acting for an employer and then goes outside of the scope of that employment and injures somebody in a negligence situation, then the principal employer is not liable. Let me give you an example. If you have an employee who makes deliveries for you, driving a truck, and that person is making deliveries, and then it becomes lunchtime, and they decide to stop off at their girlfriend's house for a little social visit. After the visit is over, they're pulling out of the driveway, and they negligently run into another car. That's what we call frolic and detour, and in most jurisdictions, the principal is not going to be liable for that activity because that was beyond the scope of employment. However, if the delivery person is expected to continue making deliveries all day long and is allowed to go to lunch, and they go to a McDonald's, and when pulling out of McDonald's they have an accident, that might be different because many states would see that as being within the scope of employment and not a frolic and detour. Okay, so that's one thing to know about vicarious liability. Another thing to know about vicarious liability is an independent contractor. And we'll hopefully get to that in a minute with some slides, but let me finish off the slides regarding scope of employment. So it has to be within the scope of the agency, whether it was authorized by the employer, the time, place, and purpose of the act, and whether the act was commonly performed by employees on behalf of the employer. So if we apply those standards to the McDonald's situation, it's authorized by the employer for the employee to get lunch, and the time, place, and purpose of the act, going to McDonald's would be appropriate. Going to girlfriend's probably would not be. And it's commonly performed by that type of employee. Okay. The employer's interest was advanced because the employee obviously has to have lunch. There was no, the private interests of the employee were not really involved like they would be if they went to the girlfriend's house. And this last one probably is not particularly applicable in this scenario I gave you, but whether the employer furnished the means by which the injury was inflicted. Did provide the truck that caused the injury in the McDonald's situation. Whether the employer had reason to know that the employee would perform the act and whether the employee had done it before. Obviously, yes, eating lunch was something that was a regular thing. And it was not a serious crime. Under the doctrine of respondent superior, the principal is liable for intentional torts committed within the scope of employment as well as negligent torts. Anything that the employer knew or should have known that the employee had a propensity to commit would create liability on the part of the principal. Also, permitting the person to engage in reckless acts would be liability on the part of the principal. Okay, so that brings us to where I wanted to get, and that's the independent contractor. Again, this is an extremely important area for business people to understand. Okay, so people who do work for a business can either be classified as employees, that is agents, or independent contractors. There is a big significant difference between the two, particularly as it relates to the employer. So if somebody is an employee, the employer has vicarious liability for those acts of the employee. If it's an independent contractor, the employer is not liable for the acts of the independent contractor. Next, if it's an employee, the employer has responsibilities with regard to wages, with regard to taking out taxes and Social Security, perhaps covering the employee for workers' compensation, and things of that nature. If it's an independent contractor, that's not the case. The employer just pays the independent contractor a flat fee and is not concerned about taxes, etc. So that can be very important from that point of view as well. So if you're getting employed in a particular job and the employer wants to treat you as an independent contractor, you need to realize those aspects of it. Let me be a little bit more specific as how it affects people, and they sometimes don't know it. When you're working as an employee, your employer pays to the Social Security Administration 13% of what you're earning to the Social Security Administration. Okay. Half of that is paid by you. The other half is paid by the employer. If you're an independent contractor, the employer does not pay any of that, and you have to pay all 13%. So if you get paid for a day's work, and let's say you made $200 for that day's work, you owe the IRS $26 that you have to pay directly to the IRS. If you were working for an employer, they would have only taken out $13. Excuse me. So that's an important thing to consider. Okay. So another thing is that many businesses today are trying to treat people as independent contractors to take advantage of those tax and liability issues. It's not always clear that they can get away with that. A classic example is the Uber case, and that's in your textbook. Uber originally maintained, and I think they still do, that their drivers are independent contractors. However, when you look at the standards used by the courts to determine whether somebody's an independent contractor or not, you see that Uber has a difficult argument and has actually lost that argument in some courts. Okay. Alright, so generally an employer is not liable for acts of independent contractors because of the lack of control. Exceptions include hazardous activities, transportation of highly volatile chemicals, or poisonous gas. Okay, an agent is liable for his or her own crimes. The principal is not liable even if the crime was committed within the scope of employment, unless the principal participated in the crime, or the principal may be liable in some situations if the nature of the crime is a regulation as opposed to a statute. Okay, so we're going to stop there. In the next part 5, we're going to get into how you identify whether somebody's an independent contractor or a agent, and whether vicarious liability applies. Remember, the magic word for Chapter 19 is agent.